They called her barren. They called her cursed. And in Red Holler, that was enough to sentence a woman to death. Clara Wynn's scream tore through the town square as the rope bit into her wrists, dragging her behind a horse that knew no mercy. The dust choked her. The stones tore her dress. And every face that watched, every single one, turned away. But then, a shadow fell across the square. A mountain man with an axe. And when that blade came down, it didn't just cut a rope. It severed everything Clara had ever known about survival, shame, and what it meant to be saved. Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The sun hung low and merciless over Red Holler, turning the dirt streets into rivers of copper dust. It was the kind of heat that made men mean and women silent, the kind that baked reason right out of a person's skull and left only the worst parts behind. Clara Wynn had known that heat all her life. She'd grown up beneath it, married beneath it, and now, God help her, she was going to die beneath it. The rope burned. That was the first thing she felt when Jedrick yanked it tight around her wrists. Not fear, not even shock, just the immediate, visceral agony of hemp cutting into flesh, the fibers scraping away skin as he knotted it with the same hands that had once promised to honor and protect her. His fingers were thick and calloused, and they moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd tied plenty of ropes in his life. Ropes for cattle, ropes for timber, ropes for a wife he'd decided was no longer worth keeping. "Barren!" he shouted, and this word cracked across the square like a whip. "Barren as a salt flat. 3 years I've given her, 3 years of my seed wasted on ground that won't grow nothing." Claire's knees buckled as he jerked her forward, but the rope kept her upright in the cruelest way, suspending her between standing and falling, forcing her body into a grotesque dance of survival. Her boots scraped against the hard-packed earth, leaving twin trails in the dust as Jedrick dragged her toward his horse. The animal sensed the violence before Clara did. Its ears flattened, its eyes rolled white. And when Jedrick tied the other end of the rope to his saddle horn, the horse stamped and snorted, already eager to bolt. "Jedrick, please!" Clara's voice came out raw, half strangled by the dust clogging her throat. "Please, I'm sorry, I'm..." "Sorry?" He wheeled on her, and the backhand came so fast she didn't have time to flinch. Her head snapped to the side, stars exploding behind her eyes, as the taste of copper flooded her mouth. "You're sorry?" 3 years, Clara. 3 goddamn years of lying beneath me, taking what I give you, and not once have you quickened with child. The crowd had begun to gather. They always did when Jedrick Cole raised his voice. He was a big man, barrel-chested and loud, the kind who commanded attention simply by existing. And in Red Holler, a town barely clinging to the edge of civilization, loud men made the rules. Clara could see them assembling at the edges of the square. Miners with dirt-black hands, shopkeepers wiping flour from their aprons, women clutching their own children close, as if infertility might be contagious. Their faces blurred together in Clara's swimming vision, a wall of judgment and morbid curiosity. "You all see this?" Jedrick's voice boomed across the square, playing to his audience now. "You all see what I've been living with? A wife who can't do the one thing the good Lord put women on this earth to do?" Someone in the crowd murmured agreement. Claire couldn't tell who. It didn't matter. They all agreed, even in their silence. In Red Holler, a woman's worth was measured in children. No children meant no worth. And no worth meant... Jedrick mounted his horse in one fluid motion, his weight settling into the saddle with the confidence of a man who'd never questioned his right to anything. The rope pulled taut, yanking Clara off her feet entirely. She hit the ground hard, her shoulder taking the brunt of impact, and then she was being dragged. The world became nothing but pain and dust and the thundering of hoofbeats. Her dress tore first, the thin cotton giving way like paper as the stones beneath her ripped and shredded. Then her skin. The rocks didn't care that she was human, that she could feel, that she was screaming. They gouged and scraped and peeled her open with geological indifference. She tried to protect her head, curling into herself as best she could, but the rope around her wrists made it impossible. Her arms were stretched out in front of her like an offering, like a sacrifice, and all she could do was turn her face to the side and pray that a rock would hit her temple hard enough to end it quickly. Through the chaos, through the screaming and the dust and the roaring in her ears, Clara could hear Jedrick laughing. It wasn't a wild laugh. That would have been easier to bear somehow. Madness she could understand, but this was controlled, deliberate. He was enjoying himself. This was entertainment. The crowd was shouting now. Some were cheering, others were calling for mercy, but their voices were thin and easily drowned out. In Red Holler, mercy was a luxury, and luxuries were scarce. Clara's vision began to gray at the edges. She couldn't tell if it was from the pain or the dust or her body simply giving up, deciding that consciousness was more trouble than it was worth. Her lungs burned. Every breath drew in more dirt than air, and she could feel herself choking on it, drowning in dust while Jedrick Cole circled his horse around the square like a ringmaster displaying his star attraction. This is how I die, she thought distantly, dragged through the dirt like refuse, not even buried, just left wherever the rope breaks or he gets tired. Her mother's face flashed through her mind, pale and pinched with disappointment even in memory. Her mother had warned her. Jedrick Cole's got a temper, she'd said the week before the wedding. But he's got land, too, and a woman alone in these parts. She'd trailed off, but the implication was clear. A woman alone was prey. Better to marry the wolf than be eaten by the pack. Clara had believed her. God help her, she'd believed every word. Another jolt, another rock catching her hip hard enough to make her bite through her lip. Blood filled her mouth, mixing with the dirt, and she spat reflexively, choking. Please, she prayed, though she couldn't have said to whom. God had never seemed particularly interested in Red Holler, and Clara couldn't blame him. Please just let it end. And then, impossibly, the dragging stopped. The sudden stillness was almost more painful than the movement had been. Clara's body, prepared for continuous trauma, didn't know what to do with the absence of it. She lay in the dirt, gasping, unable to process why the torture had ceased. Through her swimming vision, she could see Jedrick's horse, stopped in its tracks, ears pinned back, refusing to move. The animal was staring at something Clara couldn't see from her position on the ground. Move, you worthless! Jedrick kicked at the horse's sides, but the animal wouldn't budge. It stamped once, twice, then began backing up, the rope going slack for the first time since this nightmare had begun. The crowd's energy had shifted. The jeering had stopped. Even Jedrick had gone quiet, which was perhaps the most unnerving thing of all. Clara tried to lift her head, to see what had captured everyone's attention, but her body wouldn't cooperate. She managed to roll onto her side, dirt grinding into her wounds, and that's when she saw him. A man stood in the center of the square, positioned directly in the horse's path. He hadn't been there a moment ago, Clara was sure of it, but now he occupied the space with such absolute authority that it seemed impossible he could ever not have been there. He was tall, taller than Jedrick, which was saying something, and built like the mountains that surrounded Red Holler, solid, immovable, ancient. His hair was dark and long, tied back with a strip of leather, and his face was hidden behind a full beard that somehow made him look more civilized rather than less. But it was his eyes that caught Clara's attention. Even from a distance, even through her pain-blurred vision, she could see them, gray as winter storm clouds and just as unforgiving. In his right hand, he carried an axe. Not a hatchet, not a tool. An axe. The kind meant for felling trees older than Red Holler itself, with a head the size of a dinner plate and a handle worn smooth from years of use. He held it loosely, almost casually, but there was nothing casual about the way his fingers curved around it, or the way his weight settled into his stance. This was a man who knew violence. Not the performative cruelty Jedrick Cole specialized in, but the real thing. The kind that was over before you realized it had begun. Cut the rope, the man said. His voice was quiet. That was what stunned Clara most. In a town where men measured their worth in decibels, this stranger spoke barely above a conversational level. And yet every single person in that square heard him. Jedrick recovered first, his shock giving way to the familiar bluster that had served him so well in Red Holler. Who in the hell are you to— Cut the rope, the man repeated, and this time his eyes locked onto Jedrick's. The crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath. Jedrick's face flushed red. Clara had seen that color before, had learned to read it like a storm approaching. It meant violence was coming, meant he'd been challenged in a way his pride couldn't tolerate. This is my wife, Jedrick said, and Clara noticed the way his hand moved toward the pistol at his hip. My property, and what I do with my property ain't none of your concern, stranger. The man didn't move, didn't blink. Not a stranger, he said. Name's Calder Boone, and I said cut the rope." A ripple went through the crowd at the name. Clara saw it. The way people stepped back, the way hands moved away from weapons, the way even the boldest men suddenly found the ground very interesting. Boone. She'd heard that name before, whispered in the saloon, muttered by miners who'd ventured too far into the high country and come back with stories that stretched credulity. Calder Boone. The mountain man. The ghost of Red Ridge. The man who'd survived a winter in the high peaks with nothing but an axe and come down in spring with enough pelts to buy half the town if he'd wanted to. The man who'd killed a grizzly with his bare hands, or so the stories went. The man who didn't come down from the mountains for any reason, not for supplies, not for company, not for anything. Which meant his presence here, now, in this square, was significant in ways Clara's fractured mind couldn't quite process. Jedrick's hand tightened on his pistol grip. "I don't care if you're the devil himself, Boone. This is a private matter between a man and his wife, and if you don't turn around and walk away right now, I'll—" Calder moved. One moment he was standing still, axe hanging loose at his side. The next, he'd crossed the space between them, and the axe came up in a fluid arc that caught the sunlight and turned it into liquid gold. Clara heard Jedrick shout, a sound of surprise more than fear, and then the axe came down. Not on Jedrick, on the rope. The blade bit through the hemp like it was morning mist, severing it completely with a sound like tearing fabric. The rope fell away, the cut end still attached to the saddle, while the other half, still bound to Clara's wrists, dropped into the dust beside her. The horse bolted. Jedrick, caught off guard by both Calder's speed and his horse's panic, nearly went with it. He managed to stay in the saddle, but it was a near thing, and by the time he'd regained control and wheeled the animal around, Calder had positioned himself between Jedrick and Clara. Not beside her, not near her, between. A human wall, silent and absolute. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," Jedrick snarled, and now the pistol was out, pointed directly at Calder's chest. "I'll see you hanged for interfering with a man's domestic affairs. We got laws in this town, and you got laws that allow a man to drag his wife to death?" Calder's voice remained level, conversational. "That what you call justice in Red Holler?" "She's barren!" Jedrick's voice cracked on the word, desperation bleeding through the anger. 3 years I've wasted on her, 3 years of feeding and housing and providing, and she's given me nothing. A man's got a right to expect— "A man's got no right to murder," Calder interrupted, and for the first time something cold crept into his voice. Not for this, not for anything. Clara could see the crowd watching, could feel their collective judgment shifting like sand. They'd been ready to watch her die, had been enjoying it even. But Calder's presence had thrown something off balance. Here was a man who commanded respect through something other than volume, who wielded authority without needing to shout it. And more than that, he was an outsider. He didn't have to care about Red Holler's rules or traditions or the unspoken understandings that allowed men like Jedrick to thrive. Sheriff Garrett pushed through the crowd then, his badge catching the light. He was old, too old for the job, really, with a gut that hung over his belt and eyes that had learned to look away from inconvenient things. "Now, Mr. Boone," he said in the wheedling tone of a man trying to diffuse a situation he didn't understand, "I'm sure we can all settle this peaceful-like. Mr. Cole here, he's got grievances with his wife, and while his methods might be a touch extreme, there's a process for these things, and— Process." Calder turned those storm-gray eyes on the sheriff, and Garrett actually took a step back. "You watched a man drag a woman through your streets, and you call that process?" "She's his wife," Garrett said weakly. "A man's got rights." "Not this one." Calder's words fell like stones. "Not today." The standoff stretched. Jedrick still had his pistol drawn, his hand shaking now with fury and something that might have been fear. Calder stood utterly still, the axe hanging loose in his grip, looking for all the world like a man waiting for the weather to change. Clara tried to speak, to say something, anything, but her throat was too raw, her mouth too full of blood and dust. She managed only a broken sound, and even that small noise cost her. Calder's eyes flicked down to her for just a moment, and something in his expression shifted. The cold calculation gave way to something else. Not pity exactly, but recognition. like he saw something in her torn dress and bleeding wrist that struck a chord somewhere deep. When he looked back up at Jedrick, his decision was made. "You're done," he said simply. Jedrick's finger tightened on the trigger. "You threatening me?" "Stating fact?" Calder took one step forward. Just one. But it was enough to make Jedrick's horse sidestep nervously, enough to send another ripple through the crowd. "You got two choices. You drop that pistol and walk away, or you pull that trigger, and I promise you on everything holy and otherwise, you won't live long enough to regret it." The silence in the square was absolute. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, holding its breath. Clara could see the calculation happening behind Jedrick's eyes. He was a bully, not a fighter. There was a difference. Bullies picked targets they could dominate, people who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. But Calder Boone wasn't a target. He was a wall. And walls didn't care how loud you shouted or how big you were. Jedrick's pistol wavered. His face had gone from red to purple, a vein throbbing visibly in his temple. "This ain't over," he finally spat. "Not by a long shot. That's my wife, Boone. My property. And I'll have her back one way or another." "No," Calder said. "You won't." Something in those two words, the absolute certainty of them, made Jedrick flinch. He opened his mouth, closed it, then yanked his horse's head around so violently the animal whinnied in pain. "This ain't over!" he shouted again, but he was already riding away, and everyone in the square could hear the retreat in his voice. The crowd began to disperse, slowly at first, then faster as people realized there would be no more entertainment today. They filtered back to their shops and homes, already spinning the story in their minds, adding details that would grow taller with each telling. Within minutes, the square was empty except for Clara, still lying in the dirt, and Calder Boone, standing over her like a sentinel. He knelt down, slowly, carefully, like he was approaching a wounded animal. Up close, Clara could see the lines around his eyes, the scars that crisscrossed his hands, the way his clothes were worn but clean, patched but maintained. This was a man who lived hard but lived deliberately. "Can you sit?" he asked. Clara tried. God, she tried. But her body had finally reached its limit. Her arms wouldn't support her weight, and when she attempted to move her legs, white-hot pain exploded up her spine. "Easy," Calder said. And then his hands were on her, one behind her shoulders, one beneath her knees, and he was lifting her as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. Clara wanted to protest, wanted to insist she could walk, but the words wouldn't come. She was shaking too hard, her teeth chattering despite the heat. "Infirmary's 2 streets over," Calder said, more to himself than to her. "You got a doctor in this town worth a damn?" Clara managed to nod toward the east. "Dr. Sullivan," she whispered, "but he won't. Jedrick will—" "Let me worry about Jedrick Cole." Calder's voice was firm but not unkind. "Right now, you need to focus on breathing." Breathing. Yes, that seemed like a good goal. One breath at a time. In and out. Don't think about the pain or the shame or the fact that she'd just been saved by a stranger while an entire town watched her dragged like an animal. Calder carried her through the streets, and Clara was dimly aware of faces at windows, of whispers following in their wake. Tomorrow, she knew, the whole town would be talking. About her, about Jedrick, about the mountain man who'd cut the rope. But tomorrow was a lifetime away. Right now there was only the strange gentleness of being carried, the solid warmth of Calder's chest beneath her cheek, and the slow, steady rhythm of his footsteps eating up the distance between death and something that wasn't quite life yet, but might be, given time. The infirmary door banged open under Calder's boot, and Dr. Sullivan looked up from his desk with the startled expression of a man not used to emergencies. "Blessed Christ," he breathed when he saw Clara. "What happened?" "What happened," Calder said flatly, "is that Red Holler decided a woman's worth could be measured in children, and when she came up short, her husband tried to kill her for it." He laid Clara down on the examination table with a care that seemed at odds with his rough exterior, making sure her head was supported, her torn wrists visible. Dr. Sullivan was already moving, pulling out bandages and bottles, his hands shaking slightly. "Jedrick did this?" "You sound surprised." "I'm not," Sullivan admitted quietly. "God help me, I'm not surprised at all." He looked at Clara then, really looked at her, and she saw something like guilt flash across his weathered face. "I'm sorry, girl. We all knew Jedrick had a temper. Someone should have—" "Save it," Calder interrupted. "Just fix her." Clara closed her eyes as Sullivan began cleaning her wounds, the sting of alcohol nothing compared to the deeper ache settling into her bones. She could hear the two men talking over her, their voices low and serious, but the words seemed to float away before they could land. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. Or maybe it was Jedrick, already gathering men, already planning his revenge. In Red Holler, violence always came back around. It was the one thing you could count on. But for now, in this small room that smelled of carbolic and cotton, Clara let herself drift. Let herself pretend, just for a moment, that she was safe. That the rope had been cut not just from her wrists, but from everything. From Jedrick, from Red Holler, from the crushing weight of being a woman whose only value lay in something her body refused to provide. Outside, the sun continued its merciless arc across the sky. Inside, Calder Boone stood watch by the door, his axe leaning against the wall within easy reach, and for the first time in 3 years, Clara Wynne closed her eyes without fearing what she'd wake up to. If she woke up at all. The pain woke her in waves, each one cresting higher than the last until Clara had to bite down on her own tongue to keep from crying out. The room was dim. Evening had settled over Red Holler like a shroud, and for a disorienting moment she couldn't remember where she was or why every inch of her body felt like it had been dragged through hell itself. Then memory crashed back, and with it came the shame. "Easy now." Dr. Sullivan's face appeared above her, lined and worried. "You've been out for about 3 hours. Don't try to move too quick. I've got you bandaged up, but those wounds are fresh and angry." Clara's mouth was cotton dry. "Water," she managed, and Sullivan held a cup to her lips while she drank greedily, some of it spilling down her chin because her hands were wrapped too thick to grip properly. "Where—" She coughed, tried again. "Where is he?" She didn't have to specify which he she meant. Sullivan's eyes flicked toward the door. "Mr. Boone's been standing guard since I started working on you. Haven't seen a man so still in all my days, like a damn statue out there." As if summoned by his name, the door creaked open, and Calder stepped inside. He'd cleaned up since the square. The dust was gone from his clothes, though Clara noticed dark stains on his sleeves that might have been her blood. His hair was still tied back, revealing the hard angles of his face, and those storm-gray eyes swept the room once before settling on her. "You're awake," he said. Not a question. "Seems so." Clara's voice came out rough as gravel. "Though I'm not entirely sure that's a blessing." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile tugged at Calder's mouth. "I've had days like that." Sullivan busied himself checking her bandages, his movements nervous and quick. Clara recognized the energy. It was the same kind of fear flutter that happened whenever Jedrick was nearby, that constant awareness of a predator in the room. Except Calder wasn't the threat here. He was something else entirely. "How bad?" Clara asked, looking down at herself. Her dress was gone, replaced with a clean shift that must have belonged to Sullivan's late wife. Bandages covered both forearms from wrist to elbow, and she could feel more wrapping around her ribs, her hip, her left ankle. "Bad enough," Sullivan said quietly. "Deep lacerations on your arms where the rope cut in. Road rash along your right side, your back. Bruised ribs, maybe cracked. Hard to tell without you screaming when I touch them. Sprained ankle. Concussion, probably." He paused. "You're lucky to be alive, Clara." Lucky. The word sat bitter on her tongue. Lucky would have been never marrying Jedrick Cole in the first place. Lucky would have been being born a man, or rich, or anywhere but Red Holler. This wasn't luck. This was just slightly less unlucky than being dead. She can't go back there. Calder's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. He wasn't looking at her when he said it, but at Sullivan, and there was something flat and final in his tone that made it clear this wasn't up for debate. Sullivan's hand stilled on the bandage he was adjusting. "Mr. Boone, I understand your concern, but Clara is still legally married to Jedrick Cole. I can't just—" "Legally." Calder's lip curled around the word like it tasted rotten. That what matters to you, Doc? The law? Because from where I stood this afternoon, the law was real comfortable watching a woman get murdered in broad daylight. That's not fair, isn't it? Calder took one step forward, and Sullivan actually flinched. You were there. Every man in this town was there, and not one of you moved, not one of you said a damn thing until I cut that rope. The silence that followed was suffocating. Claire could see the shame written across Sullivan's face, the way his shoulders curved inward like he was trying to make himself smaller. He'd been a good doctor once. She remembered her mother saying so, but Red Holler had a way of wearing good men down to nothing. You're right, Sullivan finally said, so quiet Clara almost missed it. God help me, you're right. We should have stopped it. I should have stopped it. He looked at Clara then, and his eyes were wet. I'm sorry, girl. I'm so sorry. Clara didn't know what to say to that. Sorry didn't fix anything. Sorry didn't erase the last 3 hours, or the last 3 years, or the fact that tomorrow, when Jedrick came looking for her, every man in this town would step aside and let him take her back, because that's what the law said he could do. She stays with me, Calder said. Tonight, at least. Maybe longer. Clara's head snapped up, despite the pain it caused. What? You heard me. Calder's gaze finally shifted to her, and there was something in those gray eyes that reminded Clara of the mountains themselves. Immovable, ancient, indifferent to human concerns, but present nonetheless. Doc's right that you can't stay here. First place Jedrick will look. And you can't go back to your house, assuming that's even still an option after today. So you come with me, just until we figure out what comes next. I don't even know you, Clara protested, though the words felt hollow even as she said them. What did knowing someone matter when the alternative was going back to Jedrick? No, Calder agreed, but I know men like your husband, and I know what they do to women who've embarrassed them in public. He crossed his arms, the muscles in his forearms flexing visibly even through his sleeves. You got another option I'm not seeing? Clara opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. The truth was she didn't have another option. She had no family left in Red Holler. Her parents had died 2 winters ago from fever, and her only brother had gone west years before that, chasing gold she was certain he'd never found. She had no money of her own. Jedrick controlled everything, the house, the accounts, even the clothes on her back were technically his property. There's Widow Hanson, Sullivan offered weakly. She might take Clara in for a few days. Widow Hanson's got 4 children to feed and a landlord who'd throw her out if she crossed Jedrick Cole. Calder's voice was patient but firm, like he was explaining something to a child. Same goes for every other woman in this town who might have a kind heart. Jedrick's got power here. Money. Men who owe him favors, and right now, his pride is wounded worse than Clara's body. That makes him dangerous in ways you're not prepared for. Sullivan looked like he wanted to argue, but the words died on his lips, because Calder was right. They all knew he was right. Clara felt tears burning at the corners of her eyes and hated herself for it. She'd cried so much over the last 3 years. Silent tears into her pillow, while Jedrick snored beside her, bitter tears in the kitchen when another month passed without the pregnancy he demanded, terrified tears just this afternoon as the rope bit into her flesh. She was so goddamn tired of crying. Why? The word came out broken. Why do you care? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. So why risk yourself for... She gestured at herself, at the bandages and the shame and the brokenness. For this? Calder was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Clara could hear Red Holler settling into its evening rhythms. Horses being stabled, doors closing, someone laughing in the distance like this was just another ordinary night. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd heard it yet. Had a sister once, he said. Rowena. She died 7 years back when I was up in the high country trapping. By the time I came down and heard what happened, he trailed off, something dark and old passing across his face. Let's just say I learned what happens when good people stand by and do nothing. Learned it too late to help her, but maybe not too late to help someone else. The weight of those words settled over the room like snow. Clara wanted to ask more. Wanted to know what had happened to Rowena, why Calder carried that particular grief like a stone in his chest. But before she could speak, the door to the infirmary slammed open. Jedrick's voice boomed through the space, slurred with whiskey and fury. Where is she? Where's my goddamn wife?" Sullivan went pale. Calder's hand dropped to the knife at his belt in a motion so smooth it looked rehearsed. But it wasn't Jedrick who stumbled through the door. It was Marcus Webb, one of his drinking companions, a weasel-faced man who worked at the mining office and had always looked at Clara with eyes that made her skin crawl. "She in here, Doc?" Marcus's gaze swept the room, landing on Clara with a gleam of satisfaction. "Boss wants her home, says she's had enough coddling for one day." "She's not going anywhere," Calder said, and his voice had gone cold again. All that momentary softness burned away. "Not with you, not with Jedrick, not tonight." Marcus's hand moved toward his gun, a clumsy, telegraphed movement that marked him as someone more comfortable threatening than fighting. He never even cleared leather. Calder crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, caught Marcus's wrist in one hand and twisted. The gun clattered to the floor, and Marcus yelped like a kicked dog. "You go back to Jedrick Cole," Calder said, his face inches from Marcus's, "and you tell him his wife is under my protection now. You tell him if he wants her back, he'll have to come through me. And you make damn sure he understands what that means." He released Marcus with a shove that sent the smaller man stumbling backward into the doorframe. Marcus caught himself, his face twisted with impotent rage, but he was smart enough not to try for his gun again. "You're making a mistake, Boone," Marcus spat. "Jedrick's got friends. You might be tough, but there's only one of you, and I've survived worse than Jedrick Cole and all his friends combined." Calder's smile was sharp enough to cut. "Now get out before I decide your boss needs a more permanent message." Marcus fled, and the sound of his boots hammering down the street faded into the evening air. Calder closed the door behind him, then dragged a chair over and wedged it under the handle. It wouldn't stop a determined group, but it would slow them down. "They'll be back," Sullivan said shakily. "Jedrick will round up every man who owes him a favor, and they'll come back, and let them." Calder retrieved Marcus's abandoned gun from the floor, checked the cylinder, then tucked it into his belt beside his knife. "Doc, you got a back way out of this place?" Sullivan nodded. "Through the storage room. Leads to an alley that runs behind the Mercantile." "Good. We'll wait until full dark, then move." Calder turned to Clara. "Can you walk?" She wanted to say yes, wanted to prove she wasn't completely helpless, wasn't just dead weight to be carried from one place to another. But when she tried to swing her legs off the examination table, her ankle buckled and fresh pain lanced up her leg. Calder caught her before she could fall, his hand steady on her shoulders. "That's what I thought," he said, but there was no judgment in his voice. "Looks like I'm carrying you again." "I can try some." "Don't." He said it gently, which somehow made it worse. "You've been through enough today. No shame in needing help." But there was shame. Clara felt it burning in her chest, mixing with the pain and the fear and the desperate clawing need to be anywhere but here. Shame that she'd married Jedrick in the first place. Shame that she couldn't give him the children he wanted. Shame that she'd let herself be dragged through the streets like an animal. Shame that she now needed a stranger to protect her from her own husband. The next 2 hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Sullivan doused the lamps, and they sat in darkness, listening to red holler outside. Twice, groups of men passed by the infirmary, their voices raised and angry. Clara heard Jedrick's name, heard her own name, heard words like property and rights, and that damn mountain man thinks he can just... But they didn't try the door. Maybe they were waiting for reinforcements. Maybe they were building up courage. Or maybe, Clara thought with a bitter edge, they were waiting for Jedrick to sober up enough to lead them properly. Calder remained by the window, watching the street with the patience of a man who'd spent years stalking prey through the wilderness. He didn't pace, didn't fidget, just stood there, utterly still, his hand resting on his knife hilt. Clara found herself studying him in the darkness, the broad set of his shoulders, the way his breathing never seemed to change regardless of what was happening outside, the scars she could just barely make out on his knuckles. This was a man who'd been forged in harder places than Red Holler, she realized. A man who'd learned to survive not through bluster or violence for show, but through something quieter and more dangerous. "You really think we can make it out of town?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Calder glanced at her, his face half shadowed in the moonlight filtering through the window. I've gotten out of worse situations with worse odds. Like what? A pause. Then, once spent 3 days trapped in a canyon with a wounded leg and a pack of wolves circling. Made it out with nothing but a knife and a prayer. He turned back to the window. Red Holler's got men with guns, but they're not wolves. They'll hesitate. They'll second guess. And that hesitation is what'll keep you alive. Clara wanted to feel reassured. Instead, she just felt tired. A bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with her physical injuries and everything to do with the simple fact that this was her life now. Running, hiding, dependent on the kindness of a stranger because her own town had decided she was worth less than livestock. Finally, when the moon was high and the streets had gone quiet, Calder moved. "Time to go, Doc. You ready?" Sullivan nodded, though his hands were shaking as he gathered supplies. Bandages, laudanum, a bottle of something Clara didn't recognize. "There's a livery stable on the east edge of town," he said quietly. "Old Garrett keeps horses there. If you can make it that far without being seen, we'll make it." Calder's certainty should have been comforting. Instead, Clara found it almost frightening. What kind of man spoke with such absolute confidence about escaping an angry mob? The kind who'd done it before, she realized. Possibly more than once. Calder lifted her as easily as he had that afternoon, and Clara bit back a gasp as the movement jarred her injuries. Sullivan led them through the storage room, past shelves of medical supplies, and into a narrow hallway that smelled of dust and old paper. The back door stuck, swollen with summer humidity, and it took Sullivan precious seconds to force it open, seconds during which Clara's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. Then they were outside, the night air cool against her fevered skin. The alley stretched before them, dark and narrow, and Clara could see shadows moving at the far end, men with torches, searching. "This way," Calder breathed, and he moved down the alley in the opposite direction, his boots somehow silent despite his size and her weight. Sullivan followed, carrying his bag of supplies, and Clara could hear the old doctor's labored breathing as he struggled to keep up. They cut through yards and between buildings, Calder navigating the backways of Red Holler with surprising familiarity for someone who supposedly never came to town. Once, they had to wait pressed against a wall while 3 men passed not 10 feet away, their voices angry and wine-soaked. Clara held her breath, certain they'd be spotted, but Calder's stillness was absolute and the men walked past without ever looking their direction. The livery stable loomed out of the darkness like a cathedral, huge and dark and smelling of hay and horses. The door was barred, but Calder set Clara down gently against the wall and had it open in seconds, the bar sliding free with barely a whisper of sound. Inside, horses shifted and snorted softly, disturbed by the intrusion. Calder's hand found Clara's shoulder in the darkness. "Wait here. I'll get us mounted." He disappeared into the shadows, leaving Clara alone with Sullivan, who was breathing hard and looked on the verge of collapse. "Here." He pressed something into her hands, the bottle she hadn't recognized earlier. "Laudanum. For the pain. Don't take too much, but don't suffer needlessly either." "Doc," Clara started, but he shook his head. "No time. Listen. There's a line shack about 15 miles north, up in the foothills where the timber road forks. Used to be a logging camp, but it's abandoned now. Should have basic supplies, maybe even a stove. You get there, you rest up properly, and then..." He trailed off, because they both knew there was no "and then." There was only running until the running stopped working. Calder emerged from the darkness leading 2 horses, a sturdy bay gelding and a smaller paint mare. He'd already saddled them both, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Can you ride?" he asked Clara. She wanted to lie, but what was the point? "Not like this." He nodded like he'd expected that answer. "You'll ride with me then. Doc, can you get word to anyone who might come looking for her? Tell them she's safe, but don't tell them where." Sullivan nodded. "I'll do what I can. And Boone..." He paused, something fierce and desperate crossing his weathered face. "You keep her alive. You hear me? You keep her alive, and maybe the rest of us can start living with ourselves again." Calder swung into the saddle, then reached down for Clara. The movement of being lifted onto the horse sent fresh agony through her body, but she clenched her teeth and refused to cry out. Calder settled her in front of him, one arm firm around her waist to keep her steady, and Clara found herself pressed against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her back. "Hold on," he said quietly, and then they were moving. The stable doors burst open and they exploded into the night at a gallop, the paint mare thundering along beside them with Sullivan's supplies strapped to her saddle. Shouts erupted behind them. Someone had spotted them, and Clara heard the crack of gunfire, but then they were around a corner and racing down a side street, and the shots faded behind them. Calder guided the horse through Red Holler with the sureness of a man who could navigate by starlight alone. They crossed the river at a shallow ford, water spraying up around the horse's legs, and then they were climbing, into the foothills where the air grew thin and cool, and the lights of Red Holler became just distant pinpricks behind them. Clara didn't realize she was crying until she tasted salt on her lips. Not from pain this time, though God knew there was plenty of that. These were different tears, relief tears, grief tears, the tears of someone who just lost everything and gained nothing except the promise that tomorrow she'd wake up without a rope around her wrists. Calder's arm tightened around her waist, not painfully, just enough to let her know he felt her shaking. He didn't say anything, didn't offer false comfort or empty promises. He just held her steady as the horse carried them further into the darkness, further from the only life Clara had ever known, and she found that silence more comforting than any words could have been. They rode for hours through territory that grew increasingly rough. The trail, if it could even be called that, wound through stands of pine and across rocky streams, always climbing, always moving away from civilization and toward the wild places where men like Calder Boone made their homes. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, lulled by the rhythm of the horse's gait and the exhaustion pulling at her bones. Each time she surfaced, Calder was there, solid and unmoving, guiding them through the night. Finally, when Clara thought she couldn't endure another moment, Calder pulled the horse to a stop. "Line shack," he said quietly, just like the doc said. Clara looked up to see a small structure materializing from the darkness, barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it had a door that closed and windows that still held glass. Calder dismounted, then lifted her down with that same careful strength that was becoming familiar. Her legs wouldn't hold her weight, so he simply carried her inside and set her on a rough wooden bunk against the far wall. The interior was sparse but serviceable. A potbelly stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, shelves that held rusted cans and mason jars covered in dust. And the bunk where Clara now sat, its thin mattress probably full of mice but better than anything she'd expected to find. Calder worked quickly, getting a fire started in the stove, filling a kettle with water from the creek that ran nearby, unpacking the supplies from the paint mare's saddle. He moved with practiced efficiency, and Clara realized this wasn't the first time he'd sheltered in places like this. Wasn't the first time he'd tended to someone injured and exhausted. "Drink this." He pressed a tin cup into her hands, water, clean and cold. Clara drank it down, then accepted a second cup that tasted bitter with laudanum. "Doc said to be careful with that," she murmured, already feeling the drug's effects dulling the sharp edges of her pain. "You've earned it." Calder pulled one of the chairs over to sit near the bunk, his long legs stretched out in front of him. "Get some sleep. We'll figure out what comes next in the morning." Clara wanted to ask what he meant by that, wanted to understand why he was doing this, what he expected in return, whether he understood that by saving her he'd made himself a target too. But the laudanum was pulling her under, warm and soft and irresistible, and her questions dissolved into darkness. The last thing she was aware of was Calder sitting watch by the door, his axe across his knees, and the strange, impossible thought that for the first time in 3 years, she felt something almost like safe. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the low crackle of fire in the stove. For a disorienting moment, she thought she was back in the house she'd shared with Jedrick, that any second now he'd be shouting for his breakfast, and the panic that shot through her was so sharp it took her breath away. Then memory returned, the rope, the dragging, Calder's axe cutting through hemp, and with it came a different kind of terror. She sat up too quickly, crying out as her injuries protested, and Calder was there immediately, one hand on her shoulder to steady her. "Easy," he said. "You're safe. We're still at the line shack." Clara's breathing slowly returned to normal as she took in her surroundings in daylight. The shack looked even smaller than it had last night, The walls weathered gray and chinked with moss where the logs had separated. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the roof boards, creating dusty columns of gold in the smoky air. Calder had clearly been up for hours. The fire was well established, coffee was bubbling in a dented pot on the stove, and he'd arranged their supplies on the shelves with military precision. "How long was I out?" Claire's voice came out rough as sandpaper. "Most of the night and into morning. It's nearly noon now." Calder poured coffee into a tin cup and brought it to her. "You needed the rest. Body's got a lot of healing to do." Clara accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her bandaged hands around the cup and letting the warmth seep into her palms. Everything hurt, a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to encompass her entire body, but it was manageable. Better than yesterday. Better than being dead. "Have you slept at all?" she asked, noticing the dark circles under Calder's eyes. "Some." He settled into the chair by the door, his rifle propped within easy reach. "Enough." Clara doubted that, but she didn't push. Instead, she sipped her coffee and watched him through the steam. In daylight, she could see details she'd missed in yesterday's chaos. The way his hands, scarred and calloused as they were, moved with surprising gentleness when he handled things. The streak of silver in his dark hair that she'd initially thought was a trick of the light. The way his eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning the windows and door, even while he appeared relaxed. "Why did you really help me?" The question came out before Clara could stop it. "And don't tell me it's just because of your sister. Men don't risk their lives for strangers over old grief alone." Calder was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the window. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. "You're right. There's more to it." He paused, seemed to be weighing his words. 7 years ago, when Rowena died, I was up in the high country. Had been for near 8 months straight, trapping and hunting, avoiding people like I always did. When I finally came down that spring, I found out she'd been involved with someone who hurt her bad. Claire's chest tightened. Jedrick? No, but close enough. Calder's jaw worked. Man named Thomas Garrett, sheriff's nephew, as it turned out. He'd been courting Rowena all that winter while I was gone, and when she tried to end things, he trailed off, his hands clenching into fists. They found her body in the creek behind the mining stables. Said she'd fallen, hit her head, but Rowena was 22 years old and sure-footed as a mountain goat. She didn't just fall. The pieces began clicking together in Clara's mind. The sheriff protected his nephew. Protected him, helped him leave town, probably gave him money to start fresh somewhere else. Calder's voice had gone flat, emotionless in the way of men who've learned that feeling too much will break them. By the time I heard what happened and came looking, Thomas Garrett was long gone, and everyone in Red Holler who might have seen something or known something suddenly had convenient memory problems. Clara thought about Sheriff Garrett watching yesterday as Jedrick dragged her through the square, the old man's watery eyes, his weak protests, his ultimate inaction. He let it happen again, she whispered. He stood there and let Jedrick do the same thing to me that his nephew did to your sister. Not quite the same. You lived. Calder's eyes finally met hers, and the pain in them was raw and ancient. But yes, when I saw you in that square, saw the rope around your wrists and the whole town watching like it was Sunday entertainment, something in me just broke. Or maybe it finally healed. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. Clara set down her coffee cup, her hand shaking slightly. I'm sorry about Rowena. I'm sorry no one stood up for her. Don't be sorry, just stay alive. Calder stood, moving to the window to check the perimeter. That's the only memorial Rowena needs, other women surviving what she didn't. The conversation died there, but it had opened something between them, a shared understanding of what it meant to be failed by the people who were supposed to protect you. Clara found herself studying Calder with new eyes, seeing not just the rough mountain man who'd cut her free, but a brother still mourning, still seeking some kind of redemption he'd probably never find. The day passed slowly. Calder checked her bandages, applied fresh wrapping where the wounds were weeping, and made her eat even though she had no appetite. He'd brought basic provisions, hardtack, dried meat, beans that he cooked into something almost palatable, and he fed her with the same patient insistence a parent might use with a stubborn child. You need your strength back, he said when she tried to refuse a second helping. Can't run on empty. Run where? Clara hadn't meant for the question to sound so bitter, but there it was. Even if we make it out of these mountains, Jedrick owns half the territory between here and the next real town. He's got connections, friends, people who owe him favors. Where exactly am I supposed to run to? One day at a time, Calder said. First we heal you up, then we figure out next steps. It was while he was outside tending to the horses that Clara noticed the coat. He'd hung it on a peg by the door, and something about it caught her attention. Maybe the way the fabric bunched strangely in one pocket, or maybe just the restless energy of someone recovering from laudanum and needing something to do with her hands. She knew she shouldn't pry, knew it was a violation of the privacy of the man who'd saved her life, but curiosity won out. Her fingers closed around something small and hard in the inner pocket. When she pulled it out, her breath caught. It was a charm, a small carved bird on a leather cord, the kind of thing someone might wear around their neck. The wood was worn smooth from years of handling, and there were initials carved into the bird's belly. R.B. Rowena Boone. Claire was still staring at it when the door opened and Calder stepped inside. His eyes went immediately to the charm in her hand, and something complicated passed across his face. Not anger exactly, but a kind of resigned sadness. Found it in the creek bed where they found her, he said quietly. She always wore it. Our mother made it for her when she was just a girl. He crossed the room and gently took the charm from Clara's hand, turning it over in his fingers like he was reading Braille. Only thing I have left of her. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. It's fine. Calder tucked the charm back into his coat pocket. Nothing to hide, just memories are heavy things to carry sometimes. Clara nodded, understanding that weight all too well. But something was nagging at her, some detail her foggy mind couldn't quite grasp. The charm, the creek bed, the mining stables where Rowena had been found. The mining stables, she said slowly. Behind Red Holler, near the old shaft? Calder's head came up. That's right. Why? I remember. Clara pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to pull the memory into focus. I was just a girl then, maybe 14 or 15. I remember hearing screaming one night. My mother told me to stay inside, but I looked out the window and I saw. Her breath caught. I saw a man dragging someone. A girl. She was screaming and fighting, and he was pulling her toward the stables. There was so much screaming. Calder had gone very still. Did you see his face? Not clearly. It was dark, and I was afraid, and my mother caught me at the window and pulled me back. Clara's heart was pounding now, the memory crystallizing with painful clarity. But I remember one thing. When he passed under the lamplight near the stable door, I saw his face for just a second. He had a scar, right here. She traced a line down her left cheek. A thick scar, like from a knife wound or something. The silence that followed was absolute. Calder's face had drained of color, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Thomas Garrett didn't have a scar, never did, according to everyone I talked to. Clara felt ice forming in her stomach. Then who? Jedrick Cole. Calder's words fell like hammer blows. Jedrick Cole has a scar like that. Got it in a bar fight in his 20s, or so he tells anyone who asks. Right down his left cheek. The room seemed to tilt. Clara gripped the edge of the bunk to steady herself as the implications crashed over her. But if Jedrick killed Rowena, then Thomas Garrett took the blame. Or maybe he helped. Or maybe the sheriff just decided his nephew was a more convenient culprit than Jedrick Cole, who had money and power even back then. Calder's face had gone hard as granite, and Clara could see the rage building behind his eyes. Not the hot, explosive anger of men like Jedrick, but something colder and more dangerous. All these years, I thought Thomas Garrett murdered my sister. All these years I've been hunting the wrong man. You can't know for certain it was Jedrick, Clara said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were hollow. I was just a girl. It was dark. I could be wrong about the scar, but you're not. Calder turned to face her fully, and the certainty in his eyes was terrifying. You know you're not. That's why you're shaking right now. That's why you looked like you'd seen a ghost when you remembered. You saw Jedrick Cole drag my sister to her death, and you've been married to her killer for 3 years. Clara thought she might be sick. Her mind raced backward, cataloging every moment of her marriage through this new, horrible lens. Jedrick's violence, his cruelty, the way he'd sometimes look at her with this strange calculation, like he was weighing whether she was worth keeping alive. She'd always attributed it to his disappointment over her infertility, but now... He never mentioned knowing Rowena, she whispered. Never once in 3 years did he say anything about her. Why would he? Calder's voice was bitter. Dead women don't matter in places like Red Holler, especially dead women who don't have brothers around to ask uncomfortable questions. He moved to the window, his entire body radiating tension. I need to think. He stopped abruptly, his head cocking to the side like a wolf scenting prey. What is it? Tracks in the snow. Calder's hand dropped to his knife. Fresh ones, leading right to us. Clara's blood turned to ice. Jedrick? Who else? Calder was already moving, grabbing his rifle and checking the load. He must have had trackers out at first light. Damn it, I should have covered our trail better. This isn't your fault, Clara interrupted, and she was surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. He was always going to come after me, you know that. Knowing it and planning for it are different things. Calder positioned himself by the window, his eyes scanning the tree line. How many men does Jedrick typically ride with? 4 or 5 when he's trying to impress someone. Maybe 10 if he's serious about something. Clara tried to stand, gasping as pain shot through her ankle. We can't fight that many. Even you can't. I'm not planning to fight them. I'm planning to get you out of here. Calder pointed toward the back wall of the shack. There's a root cellar behind this place, hidden under some brush. You go down there and you stay down there no matter what you hear up here. Understand? I'm not hiding while you... Clara? He turned to face her, and the intensity in his gaze stopped her protest cold. I've spent 7 years wishing I'd been there to save Rowena. Don't make me live with failing to save you, too. Please. The word please coming from this hard, self-contained man undid something in Clara's chest. She nodded, swallowing back arguments and fear in equal measure. Okay, but Calder, if Jedrick really did kill your sister, if he's the one you've been looking for all these years... She met his eyes. Don't let rage make you stupid. Revenge isn't worth dying for. A ghost of a smile crossed Calder's face. Spoken like someone who's never needed revenge before. I'm married to Jedrick Cole, Claire said flatly. I've needed revenge for 3 years. I just never had the strength to take it. But staying alive to see him answer for what he's done, that's worth more than dying to stop him today. Calder studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. You're stronger than you think you are. No, I'm just tired of being weak. Clara let him help her toward the back door, every step sending fresh agony through her body. But I'll hide like you asked. Just promise me you won't do anything heroic and stupid. Can't promise that. Calder eased open the back door, checking the area before guiding her out. Heroic and stupid is kind of my specialty. The root cellar was exactly where he'd said it would be, a depression in the ground covered with rotting boards and overgrown with brush. Calder pulled the boards aside, revealing a dark hole that smelled of earth and old vegetables. It wasn't deep, maybe 6 feet down with a dirt floor, but it was well hidden and would have to do. There's a lamp down there and matches, Calder said as he lowered her into the darkness. But don't light it unless you absolutely have to. And Clara, he paused, his hand still gripping hers. If something happens to me, you wait until nightfall, then you head northeast. Follow the creek upstream for about 5 miles and you'll hit a trapper's cabin. Man named Ben Whitley owns it. Tell him Calder Boone sent you. He'll help. Nothing's going to happen to you, Clara said fiercely, though she had no basis for that certainty beyond desperate hope. Probably not. Calder released her hand. But if it does, you survive anyway. You hear me? You survive. And you make sure everyone knows what Jedrick Cole really is. Then he was pulling the boards back over the opening, and Clara was alone in the darkness with nothing but the sound of her own ragged breathing and the distant thunder of approaching hoofbeats. She found the lamp by feel, but heeded Calder's warning and didn't light it. Instead, she pressed her eye to a gap between the boards. Watching the line shack above her with her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs, The riders came into view moments later, 6 men on horseback, led by Jedrick Cole on his big roan stallion. Even from this distance, Clara could see the fury radiating off him, the way he sat his saddle like a king surveying conquered territory. The men with him were the usual collection: Marcus Webb, who'd come to the infirmary last night, Tobias Lang from the general store, and 3 others Clara recognized but couldn't name. All armed. All loyal to Jedrick through money or fear or both. Calder stepped out of the line shack as they approached, his rifle held loosely in his hands but clearly ready. He'd positioned himself in the doorway, using the structure for cover while still appearing casual. It was a calculated stance, not aggressive enough to provoke immediate violence, but not submissive either. "Jedrick Cole," Calder called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Figured you'd come." Jedrick reined in his horse about 20 feet away, the other men fanning out in a loose semicircle. "Where is she, Boone?" "Gone." Calder's lie was smooth as butter. "Dropped her at the stage station in Millerville around dawn. She's probably halfway to Denver by now." "You're lying." Jedrick's hand moved to his pistol. "That woman is my property, and I want her back. Now." "Property." Calder's voice went cold. "That what you call a human being? Property?" "That's what the law calls her. My wife, my responsibility, my right to discipline as I see fit." Jedrick shifted in his saddle, his eyes scanning the area around the shack. He was looking for signs of Clara, Clara realized, looking for tracks or smoke or any indication that Calder was lying. "Funny thing about the law," Calder said conversationally. "It's got rules about murder, too. You familiar with those rules, Jedrick?" Something flickered across Jedrick's face, too quick for Clara to identify, but it was there. "What the hell are you talking about?" "Rowena Boone." Calder's words fell like stones into a still pond. "My sister. Died 7 years ago near the mining stables in Red Holler. You remember her?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara could see Jedrick's jaw working, could see the way his hand tightened on his pistol grip. "Never heard of her," he finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No? That's interesting, because there's a witness who saw you drag her to those stables. Saw the scar on your face clear as day in the lamplight." Calder took 1 step forward, his rifle coming up slightly. "You want to try that again, or do you want to tell me the truth about what happened that night?" Marcus Webb spoke up then, his voice nervous. "Boss, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Marcus." Jedrick's face had gone red. That familiar color Clara knew meant violence was coming. This mountain man spinning tales, trying to distract us from the fact that he's got my wife hidden somewhere. "I'm not spinning anything." Calder's voice was hard as iron now. "You murdered my sister. You dragged her to those stables, and you killed her, and then you let Thomas Garrett take the blame for it. Probably paid the sheriff handsomely for that favor. You can't prove a damn thing." But Jedrick's voice was shaking now, and Clara could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. "It's been 7 years. Whatever you think you know. I know enough." Calder raised his rifle to his shoulder in one fluid motion. "I know you're a coward who hurts women and hides behind the law. I know you killed Rowena, and I know I'm about 3 seconds away from giving you exactly what you deserve." Everything happened at once. Jedrick went for his pistol. Marcus and the others scattered, their horses rearing and stamping. And Calder fired, not at Jedrick, but at the ground directly in front of the roan stallion's hooves. The horse screamed and bolted, nearly throwing Jedrick from the saddle. "Next one goes through your chest," Calder shouted, already working the rifle bolt. "You want to die today, Cole? Because I'm happy to oblige." But Jedrick had managed to stay mounted, and he was already spurring his horse away, shouting orders to his men. Clara couldn't make out the words over the chaos, but the intent was clear. Retreat, regroup, come back with more men and more guns. The riders thundered away, leaving nothing but churned earth and the sharp smell of gunpowder hanging in the air. Calder stood in the doorway for a long moment, his rifle still raised, making sure they were really gone. Then, slowly, he lowered the weapon and let out a breath that seemed to come from his very soul. "Clara," he called, "they're gone. You can come up." But Clara wasn't moving. She was frozen in the root cellar, her mind replaying what she'd just witnessed. The confrontation. Calder's accusation. Jedrick's reaction. The truth was out now, hanging in the air like smoke, and there was no taking it back. No pretending. No more hiding from what Jedrick Cole really was. "Clara." Calder's face appeared above her, concern written across his features. "You all right?" "He killed her," Clara whispered. "He really killed your sister, and then he married me. Knowing what he'd done, knowing what he was capable of, he married me anyway." "Yeah." Calder reached down to help her up. "He did, and now he knows that I know, which means he'll come back with everyone he can muster." Clara let Calder pull her from the cellar, wincing as her injuries protested. "He can't afford to let you live now, can't afford to let either of us live. We're witnesses to murder." "I know." Calder guided her back into the line shack, his face grim. "Which is why we're leaving, now, before he has time to organize a real hunting party." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to point out that she could barely walk, that running would just delay the inevitable, that they were trapped in these mountains with nowhere to go and an entire town ready to hunt them down. But when she opened her mouth, different words came out. "Did you mean it? What you said about giving him what he deserves?" Calder met her eyes, and in his gaze Clara saw the same cold determination she'd witnessed in the square yesterday. "Every word. But not today. Today we survive. Tomorrow we can worry about justice." He began gathering their supplies with quick efficiency, and Clara forced herself to help despite the pain. Because he was right. They had to survive first. Had to stay alive long enough to make sure Jedrick Cole answered for both his crimes, the murder of Rowena Boone, and 3 years of torment visited on Clara herself. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, and Clara couldn't tell if that was good luck or bad. Rain would cover their tracks, but it would also make traveling harder, more dangerous. Still, they had no choice. Jedrick would return with reinforcements, and when he did, he'd be coming to kill. So they would run. And Clara would learn what it meant to be hunted by the man she'd once promised to obey. The rain began as they were saddling the horses, fat drops that hit the ground like accusations, turning the dust to mud within minutes. Calder worked quickly, securing their supplies while Clara leaned against the line shack wall, trying not to let him see how much every breath cost her. The confrontation with Jedrick had drained something essential from her, leaving her hollow and shaking in a way that had nothing to do with her physical injuries. "We'll head deeper into the mountains," Calder said as he helped her onto the bay gelding, positioning her sideways in the saddle so her injured ankle wouldn't have to bear weight. "There's places up there Jedrick won't know, won't think to look. Old mining camps, abandoned homesteads. We can lose him in the high country." Clara nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed him. Jedrick Cole was many things: cruel, violent, vindictive, but he wasn't stupid. He had money and men and the entire weight of Red Holler's so-called civilization behind him. What did they have? A mountain man with a rifle, a woman who could barely walk, and the kind of truth that got people killed rather than setting them free. They rode into the rain, leaving the line shack behind like a discarded memory. The trail climbed steeply through stands of pine that grew so thick the branches formed a canopy overhead, providing some shelter from the downpour. Water ran down Clara's face, mixing with tears she hadn't realized she was crying, and she let it wash over her without trying to stop it. Crying seemed appropriate somehow. Seemed like the only honest response to discovering you'd spent 3 years sleeping beside your savior's sister's murderer. "Talk to me," Calder said after they'd been riding for over an hour. "Need to know you're still conscious." "I'm here." Clara's voice sounded strange to her own ears, thin and distant, like it was coming from someone else's mouth. "Just thinking." About? About how stupid I was. How blind. She gripped the saddle horn tighter as the horse navigated a particularly treacherous stretch of trail. There were signs, Calder. Looking back now, there were so many signs. The way he'd go quiet sometimes, staring at nothing with this look on his face like he was remembering something. The nightmares that would wake him up shouting. Once he called out a name, Rowena, but when I asked about it the next morning, he said I'd imagined it. "You couldn't have known." "Couldn't I?" Clara laughed, and it came out bitter as ash. "I knew he was violent, knew he was cruel, knew he took pleasure in hurting me, but I told myself it was my fault, that if I could just give him a child, he'd change. as if a baby could somehow transform a murderer into a decent man. Calder was quiet for a moment. The only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and rain pattering through the pines. Abuse does that, he finally said. Makes you think you're the problem. Makes you believe if you could just be better, do better, the violence would stop. But it never does. Violence is a choice abusers make, and nothing you do or don't do changes that choice. Clara turned to look at him, surprised by the insight in his words. You sound like you know something about it. My father. Calder's jaw tightened. He was a hard man, liked his whiskey more than he liked his family, and when he drank, his fists got loose. My mother took the worst of it, but Rowena and I got our share too. He paused. I was 12 when I finally got big enough to fight back. Broke his nose, couple of his ribs. He never touched any of us again after that, but the damage was already done. Rowena especially. She spent her whole life looking for someone to love her the way our father never did. And she found Thomas Garrett, who was just like him under the charm. Or maybe it was Jedrick all along. Doesn't matter now. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture Clara wished she didn't have to see. That's why you left Red Holler, why you went to the mountains. Couldn't stand being near him anymore. Couldn't stand watching my mother make excuses for him, watching the town pretend everything was normal. Calder shifted in his saddle. The mountains don't lie. They'll kill you, sure, but at least they're honest about it. No pretending to be something they're not. They rode on through the afternoon, the rain never letting up. The trail grew more difficult as they climbed. Narrow paths carved into cliff faces, creek crossings where the water ran swift and dangerous, stretches where the horses had to pick their way through rock fields that could snap a leg if they stepped wrong. Clara's body screamed with every jolt and jostle, but she gritted her teeth and endured. Pain was something she knew how to survive. Fear was something she could live with. What she couldn't survive was going back to Jedrick. As evening approached, Calder guided them off the main trail, such as it was, and into a ravine so narrow their stirrups scraped the rock walls on both sides. The ravine opened into a small box canyon with sheer walls on 3 sides and a cave mouth visible at the far end. We'll shelter here tonight, Calder said, dismounting and helping Clara down. Cave's deep enough to hide a fire, and there's only one way in. Easier to defend than the line shack was. Clara limped toward the cave, her ankle throbbing with each step. Inside, the space was larger than she'd expected, maybe 20 feet deep and 12 feet wide, with a ceiling high enough for Calder to stand upright. The floor was covered in pine needles, and there were scorch marks on the walls from old fires. Someone had used this place before. Maybe Calder himself. How often do you come up here? She asked as he began building a fire. Used to live up here full time, first few years after Rowena died. Had a cabin about 5 miles north near the tree line. Calder struck flint to steel, coaxing sparks into the kindling. Spent my days hunting and trapping, my nights trying to drink away what I couldn't change. Wasn't much of a life, but it was mine. What made you come back down? Ran out of whiskey. He said it deadpan, and Clara actually laughed. A real laugh that surprised them both. Calder's mouth quirked. Also, Ben Whitley told me if I didn't come down and rejoin the living, he was going to drag me down himself. Said I was dishonoring Rowena's memory by wasting my life in the wilderness. Was he right? Probably. The fire caught, flames licking up through the kindling. But I needed that time. Needed to grieve without everyone in Red Holler watching, judging, whispering about poor Calder Boone who couldn't save his sister. Clara settled near the fire, letting the warmth seep into her bones. Her dress was soaked through, and she was shivering despite the flames. Calder noticed and dug through their supplies, pulling out a spare shirt of his, rough homespun that would swallow her whole. Turn around, she said, and he did without comment. Clara struggled out of her wet dress, hissing as the movement pulled at her injuries, and pulled on Calder's shirt. It hung past her knees like a dress itself, and smelled of pine smoke and leather, and something indefinably masculine that made her feel safer than it probably should. All right, she said, and Calder turned back around. His eyes swept over her once, assessing rather than appreciative, and he nodded to himself before hanging her wet dress near the fire to dry. They ate in silence, more hardtack and dried meat, washed down with water Calder had collected from a spring near the cave mouth. It wasn't much, but Clara's appetite had returned somewhat, which she took as a good sign. The laudanum was wearing off, leaving the pain sharper, but her mind clearer. She needed to think, needed to plan. Because running forever wasn't a solution, and they both knew it. "What happens when we run out of mountain?" Clara asked, breaking the silence. Calder poked at the fire with a stick. "We figure something else out." "That's not a plan." "No, but it's all I've got right now." He met her eyes across the flames. "I'm open to suggestions if you've got any." Clara pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. The movement hurt, but the position made her feel smaller, safer, somehow. "We could go to the federal marshal. Tell him what Jedrick did to your sister, what he tried to do to me. Get the law involved properly." "Marshal's office is in Denver. That's 2 weeks hard riding from here, and you're in no shape for it. Plus, it's been 7 years since Rowena died. Any evidence is long gone, and all we've got is your memory of seeing a man with a scar. No body to exhume, no witnesses willing to speak up, nothing but our word against Jedrick's." Calder shook his head. "Marshal would take one look at the situation and tell us it's a local matter, send us right back to Red Holler and Sheriff Garrett. So we're trapped." Clara felt something cold and heavy settling in her chest. "No way forward, no way back. There's always a way." Calder's voice was firm. "Might not be a good way or an easy way, but there's always a way." They fell silent again, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside the cave, night had fallen completely, turning the canyon into a pocket of absolute darkness broken only by their fire. Rain still pattered down, but softer now, more of a steady drizzle than the earlier downpour. Clara found herself drifting, exhaustion pulling at her like an undertow. She must have dozed off because when she opened her eyes again, the fire had burned down to embers, and Calder was at the cave mouth, silhouetted against the lesser darkness outside. He was holding his rifle, his entire body tense in a way that brought Clara instantly alert. "What is it?" she whispered. "Thought I heard something, probably just an animal, but—" He trailed off, his head cocked to the side like a wolf listening for prey. Clara's heart began to hammer. Could it be Jedrick? Not unless he knows these mountains better than I think he does. This canyon's well hidden, and we didn't leave much of a trail in the rain. But Calder didn't sound entirely convinced. "Stay back from the fire. If something's out there, I don't want you silhouetted against the light." Clara obeyed, pressing herself against the cave wall where the shadows were deepest. Minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. She strained her ears, trying to hear what Calder had heard, but there was nothing except rain and wind and the occasional rustle of pine branches. Then, clear as a bell, a horse whinnied. Calder cursed under his breath and moved deeper into the cave, positioning himself so he could see the entrance while remaining in shadow. "They found us," he said quietly. "Don't know how, but they found us." "What do we do?" "We wait. Canyon's got one entrance, which means they can't surround us. They want to come in here, they have to do it single file through that ravine, and I'll drop the first 3 before they get close." His voice was cold, tactical. "Problem is, they can also just wait us out. Block the entrance, starve us until we're weak enough to take easily." Clara's mind raced. "How many do you think?" "Can't tell yet, but if Jedrick's smart, he brought everyone he could muster. Probably 15, 20 men. Maybe more." "You can't fight 20 men. Watch me." Calder's smile in the darkness was wolf-like. "I've survived worse odds." "When?" "Winter of 52. Holed up in a cabin with a broken leg while a band of claim jumpers tried to smoke me out. There were 8 of them and 1 of me, and I was delirious with fever from the break going bad." He checked his rifle's load. "I'm alive." "They're not. Simple math." Clara wanted to find comfort in his confidence, but the situation was fundamentally different. Then he'd been alone. Now he had her. Injured, slow, a liability he'd have to protect while also defending their position. She was going to get him killed. The thought crystallized into certainty, and with it came a decision Clara had been avoiding since the moment Calder cut her free in the town square. She couldn't let him die for her. Wouldn't let another person sacrifice themselves because she'd been too weak, too blind, too broken to save herself. "I'm going out there," she said. Calder's head whipped around. "The hell you are." "Listen to me." Clara pushed herself off the wall, her ankle screaming in protest. They want me, not you. If I go out there, if I give myself up, maybe they'll leave you alone. Maybe nothing. Calder crossed the space between them in 2 strides, his hands gripping her shoulders. Not hard, but firm enough to make her focus. You go out there, Jedrick kills you. Maybe not right away. Maybe he drags you back to Red Holler first, makes an example of you. But you die either way, and I don't save people just to watch them walk into their own executions. Better me than both of us. No. The word was flat, absolute. Not happening. You want to give up? You want to quit fighting? You do that after we survive this. But right now you stay in this cave and you let me do what I do best. Which is? Survive. He released her shoulders and returned to the cave mouth. Now get back against that wall and stay quiet. If shooting starts, you cover your ears and keep your head down. Understand? Clara wanted to argue, wanted to scream that this wasn't fair, that he didn't deserve to die defending someone he barely knew. But the look on his face stopped her. This was a man who'd spent 7 years carrying guilt over a sister he couldn't save. He wasn't going to let history repeat itself. Not today. Not with her. So she retreated to the wall and waited. A voice echoed through the canyon, distorted by the rain and distance, but unmistakably Jedrick's. Boone, I know you're in there. Send Clara out and we can end this peaceful-like. Calder didn't respond. Didn't even twitch. He just stood there, rifle raised, watching the ravine entrance with the patience of stone. She's my wife, Boone. Jedrick's voice had taken on a wheedling quality. You got no right to keep her from me. I'm willing to let bygones be bygones about what you said earlier, about Rowena and all that. Just send Clara out. Still, Calder said nothing. Clara could see the calculation behind his eyes, the way he was measuring distances and angles and lines of fire. This was a man in his element, and despite everything, despite the terror clawing at her throat, she felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. Last chance, Boone, you don't send her out, we're coming in. And I've got 20 men with me, all armed, all ready to do what needs doing. You can't fight all of us. Actually, Calder called back, his voice carrying across the canyon with surprising clarity, I think I can. But let's test that theory, shall we? He fired once, not at anyone visible, but at something beyond Clara's line of sight. There was a scream, a crash, and then chaos erupted. Men were shouting, horses were panicking, and Clara could hear Jedrick bellowing orders over the din. That was a warning shot, Calder shouted. Next one goes through a chest. Turn around and ride out of here while you still can. The response was a hail of gunfire that sparked against the rocks near the cave mouth. Calder dropped into a crouch, unfazed, and returned fire with methodical precision. 1 shot, 2. Each one followed by a scream or curse from the darkness. The man wasn't just shooting randomly, he was hitting what he aimed at. But there were too many of them. Even Clara, who knew nothing about tactics or warfare, could see that. For every shot Calder fired, a dozen came back. The cave provided good cover, but eventually they'd either rush the position or simply keep them pinned until dawn, at which point picking them off would be easy. Calder, Clara said urgently. There has to be another way out of here, a back exit, a crack in the rock, something. Nothing big enough for us. Calder fired again, and someone cursed. Canyon's a trap if you're defending, which is why I picked it. Didn't count on them finding us this fast. So what's the plan? Working on it. Another shot, another cry of pain. How's your ankle? Can you run if you have to? Define run. Move faster than walking while people shoot at you. Clara tested her weight on the injured ankle and immediately regretted it. For maybe 30 seconds before it gives out completely. Might be enough. Calder reloaded his rifle with practiced speed. There's a gap in the ravine wall about halfway to the entrance. Hidden by an outcrop, easy to miss in the dark. If I can create enough chaos, you might be able to slip through it while they're focused on me. And go where? Anywhere that isn't here. Calder glanced at her. The paint mare's tied just outside. You get to her, you ride north. Don't stop until you hit Ben Whitley's cabin. He'll protect you. I'm not leaving you. You don't have a choice. Calder fired twice in quick succession. This isn't about bravery or loyalty or any of that noble garbage. This is about survival, mine and yours, and right now the best chance either of us has is if you get clear while I keep them busy. Clara felt tears burning at the corners of her eyes again. You'll die. Probably not. I'm surprisingly hard to kill. His smile was grim. But if I do, you make sure everyone knows the truth about Jedrick, about Rowena, about all of it. That's all I ask. Before Clara could respond, the pattern of gunfire changed. Instead of random shots, it became coordinated. A barrage meant to keep Calder's head down while men advanced up the ravine. Clara could see shapes moving in the darkness, counting at least 5 men working their way forward under covering fire. "They're rushing us," Calder said calmly. "This is it. You ready?" Clara wasn't ready, would never be ready. But she nodded anyway because what else could she do? "On 3, you run for that gap. Don't look back, don't hesitate, just run." Calder took a deep breath. 1. Clara gathered herself, ignoring the screaming protest from her ankle. 2. The advancing men were closer now, maybe 20 yards from the cave mouth. 3. Calder stood and began firing in rapid succession, working the rifle bolt so fast it seemed like one continuous roar. Men dove for cover, their advance halting as Calder's bullets found home with devastating accuracy. And in that moment of chaos, Clara ran. Her ankle betrayed her immediately, buckling on the second step. She caught herself, pushed off the wall, and staggered forward. The gap Calder had mentioned was there, barely visible, just a crack between 2 rock faces that looked too narrow for a person to squeeze through. Clara threw herself at it anyway, wedging her body into the opening. Rock scraped her shoulders, her hips, tearing at Calder's shirt and the bandages underneath. Behind her, the gunfight continued, Calder's rifle punctuating the chaos like a metronome counting down to disaster. Then she was through, stumbling out into the narrow canyon on the other side. The paint mare was exactly where Calder had said it would be, tied to a scrub pine and wild-eyed with fear. Clara grabbed for the reins with her bandaged hands, managed to get hold of them, and pulled herself toward the saddle. Getting mounted with an injured ankle and torn wrists was a nightmare, but terror gave her strength she didn't know she had. She got her good foot in the stirrup, hauled herself up, and nearly screamed as pain exploded through her body. But she was in the saddle. She was mounted. The horse needed no urging. It bolted the moment Clara was seated, racing away from the gunfire and chaos. Clara clung to the saddle horn, her vision graying at the edges, trees whipping past in a blur of shadow and rain. Behind her, the gunfire reached a crescendo and then suddenly cut off. Clara's heart stopped. The silence was worse than the noise had been, because silence meant something had ended. Someone had won, someone had lost, and Clara was riding away too fast to know which. She wanted to turn back, wanted to wheel the horse around and race back to the canyon to see if Calder was alive or dead. But his last words echoed in her mind. Don't look back. Don't hesitate. Just run. So she ran, through the rain and the darkness, through pain that made her want to pass out, through country she didn't know toward help that might not exist. She ran because Calder had told her to, because staying alive was the only way to make his sacrifice, if it had been a sacrifice, mean something. The paint mare knew where it was going better than Clara did, following trails Clara couldn't see in the darkness. Time became meaningless. They could have been riding for minutes or hours. Clara couldn't tell. Everything hurt. Everything was cold and wet and terrifying. But she stayed in the saddle through sheer stubbornness, through the knowledge that falling now meant dying. When she finally saw the cabin materializing out of the darkness like a ghost made solid, Clara wasn't sure if it was real or a hallucination brought on by pain and exhaustion. But the paint mare headed straight for it, and Clara let the horse carry her forward. She fell from the saddle more than dismounted, hitting the ground in a heap. The cabin door flew open and a man appeared, older, bearded, holding a shotgun. Ben Whitley, if Calder had been telling the truth. "Help," Clara managed, and it came out as barely a whisper. "Calder Boone sent me. We need to..." And then the darkness she'd been fighting finally claimed her, pulling her down into unconsciousness with the taste of rain and blood in her mouth. Clara woke to firelight and the smell of coffee, her body one continuous ache that seemed to have no beginning or end. For a disorienting moment, she thought she was back in the line shack with Calder standing watch, but then memory crashed back and she sat up so fast her vision swam. "Easy now." A weathered hand pressed gently on her shoulder. "You're safe. You're at my cabin. Name's Ben Whitley. Calder sent you here." Clara's eyes adjusted to reveal a man in his 60s with a face like cracked leather and eyes that held more kindness than she'd seen in years. He was wrapping fresh bandages around her wrists with surprising gentleness for someone with such work-hardened hands. "Calder," Clara managed, her throat raw. Did he? "Don't know yet." Ben's honesty was somehow more comforting than false reassurance would have been. "You came in alone on his paint mare near midnight, half dead from exhaustion and blood loss. Been about 6 hours since then. Sun's coming up now, and I'm about to ride out to see what I can find." 6 hours. Calder could have bled out in 6 hours, could have been captured and hanged, could have been shot and left to die in that canyon while Clara ran away like a coward. The guilt was crushing, pressing down on her chest until she couldn't breathe properly. "I left him," she whispered. "He told me to run, and I left him there with 20 men, and I ran." "Because he told you to." Ben's voice was firm. "And if I know Calder Boone, which I do, known him since he was knee-high to a grasshopper, he wouldn't have told you to run unless he had a plan. That man survived things that would kill most folks 3 times over. Got more lives than a barn cat." Clara wanted to believe him, but hope felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. She'd hoped before. Hoped Jedrick would change. Hoped someone in Red Holler would help her. Hoped the law would protect her. Hope had failed her every single time. "I need to tell you something," she said, and proceeded to explain everything. The dragging, Calder cutting the rope, the revelation about Rowena Boone, the chase through the mountains. Ben listened without interrupting, his face growing increasingly grim as the story unfolded. "Always knew Jedrick Cole was rotten," Ben said when she finished. "But killing Rowena," he shook his head, "that explains a lot. Explains why Calder came back down from the high country 3 days ago looking like death himself, asking questions about Thomas Garrett and that night 7 years back. I told him to let it lie, that digging up old graves never brought peace to anyone. Guess he didn't listen." "He never would have known if I hadn't remembered," Clara's voice cracked. "If I'd just kept my mouth shut, then Jedrick would still be walking around free, and Rowena's murder would stay buried." Ben stood, moving to the small stove to pour coffee. "Sometimes truth is a harder burden than lies, girl, but it's still truth. And truth has a way of demanding justice, whether we're ready for it or not." He handed her the coffee, and she wrapped her damaged hands around it, letting the warmth seep into her bones. Through the cabin's single window, she could see dawn breaking over the mountains, a pale, watery light that turned the pine trees into dark sentinels, standing guard against the coming day. "I'm riding out to find Calder," Ben said, pulling on a heavy coat. "You stay here, keep the door barred, and don't open it for anyone except me or him. There's a shotgun above the mantel if you need it. Both barrels are loaded. You know how to shoot?" Clara shook her head. "Pull the hammers back, point it at whatever scares you, and squeeze both triggers. Can't miss at close range." Ben headed for the door, then paused. "And Clara? Don't give up on him yet. Calder Boone's got a habit of surviving things he shouldn't." Then he was gone, and Clara was alone with the fire, and her thoughts, and the crushing weight of not knowing. She tried to rest, tried to let her battered body heal, but every sound from outside sent adrenaline spiking through her veins. The creak of a branch, the skitter of a squirrel across the roof, the distant call of a crow. Each one could be Jedrick's men closing in, could be the end coming for her in this small cabin at the edge of the world. Hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Clara changed her own bandages as best she could, wincing at the angry red lines where the rope had cut deepest. She forced herself to eat some of the bread and dried meat Ben had left out, knowing she needed strength even though her stomach rebelled at the thought of food. And she waited. The sun was high when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Clara grabbed the shotgun with shaking hands, pulling back the hammers like Ben had shown her, and positioned herself where she could see the door, but had the wall at her back. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. The door rattled. "Clara, it's Ben. I'm coming in." But Clara had heard too many lies in her life to trust easily. "How do I know it's really you?" "Because I'm too damn old to play games, and because if I was Jedrick Cole or his men, I'd have just kicked the door in instead of asking permission." A pause. "Also, I've got Calder with me. He's alive, but he's in a bad way. Need you to lower that shotgun and help me get him inside." Clara nearly dropped the weapon in her haste to unbar the door. It swung open to reveal Ben supporting Calder, who looked like he'd been through a war. His face was gray beneath the dirt and blood. His left arm hung useless at his side, and there was a bandage wrapped around his torso that was already seeping red. "Jesus Christ," Clara breathed, and then she was moving, ignoring the screaming protest from her ankle as she helped Ben half carry, half drag Calder to the narrow cot against the far wall. "Took a bullet in the shoulder," Ben said tersely, already working to cut away Calder's shirt. Another grazed his ribs. Lost a fair amount of blood, but nothing vital was hit. Tough bastard managed to hold them off long enough that they gave up and retreated. Found him at dawn, passed out in that cave but still breathing. Clara stared at the wounds with a mixture of horror and relief. He was alive. Against all odds, despite everything, Calder Boone was alive. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, pushing past the fear and shock to find the practical core that had kept her alive through 3 years with Jedrick. "Water, clean cloth, and whiskey if Ben's got any." Calder's voice was rough but conscious. His eyes found Clara's. "You made it. Good. You almost died." Clara's hands were shaking as she grabbed supplies. "You stood there and let 20 men shoot at you so I could escape, and you almost died." "Almost doesn't count." Calder tried to smile, and it came out as more of a grimace. "Besides, it was only 16 men, and I got at least 4 of them before they figured out charging the cave was a bad idea." "He's being modest," Ben said, cleaning the shoulder wound with ruthless efficiency that made Calder hiss through his teeth. "I found 3 bodies in that ravine, and blood trails from at least 2 more. He didn't just hold them off. He damn near routed them single-handed." Clara brought the supplies with shaking hands, watching as Ben worked to extract the bullet from Calder's shoulder. The mountain man bore it with gritted teeth and white-knuckled fists, refusing the whiskey Ben offered until the worst of it was done. When the bullet finally came free with a wet sound that made Clara's stomach turn, Calder let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. "That's the second time I've been shot in that shoulder," he said, his voice tight with pain. "Starting to think I should protect it better." "Starting to think you should stop getting shot at entirely," Clara retorted, and surprised herself with the sharpness in her voice. "What were you thinking? You could have run too, could have slipped out behind me and let them chase us both? While you can barely walk and I'm trying to cover our retreat?" Calder shook his head. "Better to make a stand where I had the advantage. Canyon walls, single approach, good cover, basic tactics. Basic suicide, more like." But Clara's anger was draining away, replaced by exhaustion and relief so profound it made her dizzy. He was alive. They were both alive. Against every reasonable expectation, they had survived. Ben finished bandaging Calder's wounds and stepped back to wash the blood from his hands. "They'll come again," he said flatly. "Maybe not today while they're licking their wounds, but soon. Jedrick Cole's not the type to let this go, especially now that you've cost him men and made him look weak." "I know." Calder tried to sit up and immediately thought better of it. "Which is why we need to change the game. Stop running and start fighting back." "How?" Clara demanded. "There's 3 of us, 1 old man, 1 shot-up mountain man, and 1 woman who can barely walk. Jedrick has an entire town backing him, money, weapons, and the law on his side. What exactly do you propose we do?" Calder's eyes met hers, and despite the pain and exhaustion written across his face, there was steel in that gaze. "We take away his power. His influence in Red Holler is built on fear and money, and the illusion that he's untouchable. So we shatter that illusion. We make everyone in that town see what he really is." "They already know what he is," Clara said bitterly. "They watched him drag me through the streets and did nothing. Because they thought they had no choice, because standing up to Jedrick alone meant death or ruin." Calder shifted, wincing. "But what if they weren't alone? What if enough people stood together?" Ben snorted. "You're talking about organizing a rebellion in a frontier town where the sheriff's corrupt, the wealthy back Jedrick, and everyone else is too scared or too beaten down to fight. Good luck with that." "Not luck. Evidence." Calder looked at Clara. "You said you saw him drag Rowena to the stables. Were there any other witnesses? Anyone else who might have seen something but was too afraid to speak up?" Clara thought back, her memory of that night sharpening with effort. There were lights on in some of the buildings near the stables. The assayer's office, I think. An old Mrs. Chen who lived above the laundry, her window faced that direction. Mrs. Chen died 2 years back, Ben said, but her daughter still runs the laundry, and Harold Wade was the assayer then. Still is, far as I know. If either of them saw something, they'll never testify against Jedrick, Clara interrupted. Not publicly. He'd destroy them. Not if he's already destroyed. Calder's smile was grim. We don't need testimony. We just need doubt. Need enough people questioning what they've been told about Rowena's death that the whole story starts to unravel. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to point out all the ways this plan could fail. But before she could speak, the sound of approaching horses froze everyone in place. Multiple riders coming fast. Ben grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. 6 men, armed, and that's Jedrick Cole in the lead. Clara's blood turned to ice. How did they find us? Tracked the paint mare, probably. Should have known they'd be able to follow her prints in the mud. Calder was already trying to stand, his face going gray with effort. Ben, get Clara out the back. There's a root cellar. No. The word came out of Clara's mouth before she'd consciously decided to say it. No more running, no more hiding in cellars while men fight and die because I'm too weak to stand on my own. She moved to the window, looking out at the approaching riders, and something inside her crystallized into certainty. I'm done being dragged, done being property, done being the reason good men get hurt. Clara, Calder started, but she cut him off. You said we needed to shatter the illusion, make people see what Jedrick really is. Clara turned from the window to face both men. Then that's what we do, right now, right here. Ben and Calder exchanged glances. What exactly are you proposing? Ben asked carefully. I'm proposing we give Jedrick exactly what he wants, me. Clara's voice was steady despite her racing heart. But we do it in Red Holler, in the town square, with every witness we can gather. We make him face what he did, to me, to Rowena, to everyone he's ever hurt, and we make the town choose whether they're going to stand with him or against him. That's insane, Calder said flatly. He'll kill you the moment he gets his hands on you. Maybe, or maybe he'll be so convinced he's won that he'll get cocky, make mistakes. Clara moved to the door, her hand on the latch. Either way, I'm tired of being afraid. Tired of surviving instead of living. If I'm going to die, I'd rather die standing than spend the rest of my life running. The riders were close now, close enough that Clara could hear Jedrick's voice shouting orders. She took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped outside before either man could stop her. Jedrick reined in his horse 20 feet from the cabin, his face a mask of fury and triumph when he saw her. There you are. Been looking all over these damn mountains for you. I know. Clara's voice carried across the distance between them, stronger than she'd expected. That's why I'm here, to end this. End this? Jedrick laughed, but it sounded hollow. You think you get a say in how this ends? You're my wife, Clara. My property. And I'm taking you home where you belong. I'm not going anywhere with you. Clara stood her ground despite the terror clawing at her throat. Not until we go back to Red Holler and you tell everyone the truth about what happened to Rowena Boone. The change in Jedrick's expression was instantaneous, shock giving way to rage so pure it twisted his features into something barely human. You shut your mouth about Rowena. Why? Because you killed her? Because you dragged her to the stables 7 years ago and murdered her, then let Thomas Garrett take the blame? Clara's voice rose, projecting so that every man with Jedrick could hear. I saw you that night. Saw your face in the lamplight. Saw the scar on your cheek. I was just a girl then and too scared to speak up, but I'm not scared anymore. You lying bitch! Jedrick went for his gun, but Marcus Webb, who'd been riding beside him, caught his arm. Boss, wait. If she's saying this in front of witnesses, I don't give a damn about witnesses. Jedrick shook Marcus off. She's lying. Making up stories because she's trying to save her own skin. Then prove it. Calder's voice came from the cabin doorway. He was leaning heavily against the frame, his face gray and his wounded arm held tight against his chest, but his voice was strong. Prove she's lying. Come back to Red Holler with us. Let the whole town hear what she has to say. If it's lies, they'll see through them. But if it's truth, he let the implication hang in the air. Jedric's face had gone from red to purple, the vein in his temple throbbing visibly. "You're dead, Boone, you hear me? Dead. You and every person who helps you. I'll burn this whole goddamn mountain down before I let you destroy me." "You already destroyed yourself." Calder's words were quiet, but they cut through Jedric's rage like a blade. "You destroyed yourself the night you killed my sister. Everything that's happened since, Clara, this chase, the men you've lost, that's just the debt coming due." For a long moment, no one moved. The standoff hung in the balance, teetering on the edge of violence. Clara could see Jedric's men shifting uneasily in their saddles, could see the doubt creeping into their expressions as they processed what they'd heard. These were rough men, men who'd done rough things, but most of them weren't murderers. Most of them had families, had some line they wouldn't cross. And Jedric had just been accused of crossing that line. "You got a choice," Ben called out from behind Calder, his rifle visible. "You can try to take Clara by force and turn this into a bloodbath that'll have federal marshals crawling all over Red Holler, or you can do this the civilized way. Come back to town. Let folks hear both sides. Let them decide." "Decide?" Jedric spat the word like poison. "I don't need anyone to decide anything. That's my wife. The law also says you can't murder people," Calder interrupted. "And if Clara's telling the truth, if you really did kill Rowena, then you're going to hang regardless of what any marriage certificate says." The calculation was visible on Jedric's face. He was weighing his options, trying to find an angle that preserved his power and control. Clara could almost see the gears turning behind his eyes. "Fine," he finally said, and the word dripped with false reasonableness. "We'll go back to Red Holler. Have ourselves a proper hearing. Let the sheriff sort this out legal-like." His smile was sharp as broken glass. "But when this is done, when everyone sees you're lying, I'm going to make you wish I'd killed you quick in these mountains. Going to drag you through those streets every day until you're begging me to end it." "If I'm lying," Clara said evenly, "then I'll deserve it. But I'm not lying, Jedric, and deep down, you know it." The ride back to Red Holler was the longest of Clara's life. They formed a strange procession, Jedric and his men in front, Clara riding double with Ben, and Calder bringing up the rear despite his wounds. The mountain man had insisted on coming even though every jostle of the horse clearly caused him agony. His presence was both comfort and concern. Clara didn't want him dying on her behalf, but she also knew she'd never make it through this without him. They reached Red Holler just after noon, and word of their arrival spread like wildfire. By the time they reached the town square, the same square where Clara had nearly died days before, it seemed like every resident had turned out to watch. They packed the streets, lined the boardwalks, filled windows and doorways with faces hungry for spectacle. Sheriff Garrett was waiting in the square, his face drawn and worried. Whatever he'd been told about this gathering, it was clear he hadn't expected it to be this public or this large. "Jedric," he started, his voice placating, "maybe we should discuss this in my office, private-like." "No." Clara's voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "This gets discussed here, in front of everyone. No more private conversations. No more looking the other way. Everyone in this town is going to hear the truth, and then they're going to have to decide what kind of place they want Red Holler to be." The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. Claire could see familiar faces, Dr. Sullivan looking guilty and hopeful, Marcus Webb looking trapped, women she'd known for years who'd watched her being dragged and done nothing, all of them waiting to see what would happen next. 7 years ago, Clara began, her voice shaking but growing stronger with each word, a woman named Rowena Boone was murdered. Her body was found in the creek behind the mining stables, and everyone was told she'd fallen and hit her head, but she didn't fall. She was dragged there and killed. And I know this because I saw it happen. The murmuring grew louder. Calder had dismounted and was standing near Clara now, his mere presence adding weight to her words. "I was 14 years old," Clara continued. "It was late at night, and I heard screaming. When I looked out my window, I saw a man dragging a girl toward the stables. She was fighting, trying to get away, but he was too strong. And when he passed under the lamplight, I saw his face." She turned to look directly at Jedric. "I saw your face, Jedric Cole. Saw the scar on your cheek. Saw you drag Rowena Boone to her death." The crowd erupted. Some people shouted denials. Others called for Clara to be arrested for slander. But there were also voices calling for Jedrick to answer the accusation, demanding he defend himself. Jedrick's face had gone from purple to almost white. "She's lying. She's a hysterical woman who's been through trauma, and her mind is—" "Harold Wade, but—" Calder's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "You were the assayer 7 years ago. Your office window faced the mining stables. Did you see anything that night?" An elderly man near the front of the crowd went pale. I don't—" "Tell them," Calder pressed. "You've carried this for 7 years. Tell them what you saw." Harold Wade looked like he wanted to run, wanted to disappear into the crowd and pretend he'd never been called on. But hundreds of eyes were on him now, and there was nowhere to hide. "I saw someone," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A man, dragging someone toward the stables. It was dark and I couldn't see clear, but—" He swallowed hard. "But there was shouting, screaming, and the next morning when they found that poor girl—" He trailed off, but the implication was clear. "Why didn't you say anything?" someone in the crowd demanded. "Because I was scared," Harold's voice cracked. "Because Jedrick Cole had money and power, and I was just an assayer who could be replaced. Because I told myself maybe I was wrong, maybe I didn't see what I thought I saw. Because it was easier to stay quiet than to get myself killed standing up." A ripple went through the crowd. Recognition, shame, understanding. How many of them had stayed quiet about something? How many had looked away from inconvenient truths? "Mrs. Chen's daughter," another voice called out. It was a small Chinese woman Clara recognized from the laundry. "My mother told me before she died, said she saw something that night. A man with a scarred face dragging a girl. She was afraid to speak because—" The woman's voice hardened. "Because men like Jedrick Cole don't face justice in towns like this. They buy it. They threaten it. They make it disappear." More voices joined in, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. A miner who'd heard Jedrick bragging drunkenly about teaching a girl a lesson years ago. A shopkeeper who'd seen Thomas Garrett being paid off by Sheriff Garrett to leave town quick. A woman who'd noticed Rowena's charm, the carved bird, in Jedrick's pocket the week after she died, though he'd claimed he found it in the street. Piece by piece, the truth assembled itself in the town square. Not perfect, not complete, but damning nonetheless. And with each new voice, Jedrick's position crumbled a little more. "These are lies!" Jedrick was shouting now, his control fracturing. "All of you, you're letting this woman and this mountain man poison your minds against me. I've done more for this town than any of you. I provided jobs, built businesses, kept the law. You kept nothing." The shout came from Dr. Sullivan, who pushed his way to the front of the crowd. "You broke the law. You murdered that girl, and then you married Clara and tortured her for 3 years. And I watched it happen. We all watched it happen. And we did nothing because we were cowards." The doctor's voice broke on the last word, but he pressed on. "I took an oath to do no harm, and I violated that oath every single day I stayed silent while you hurt Clara. Every day I bandaged wounds I knew came from your fists and said nothing. I'm done being silent. I'm done being a coward." Others took up the cry, a cacophony of voices finally finding the courage to speak truth to power. The dam had broken, and Red Haller's long-suppressed conscience came flooding out. Sheriff Garrett tried to restore order, but his voice was drowned out. And when he reached for Jedrick, whether to arrest him or protect him, Clara would never know, Jedrick snapped. He lunged at Clara with a roar of pure rage, his hands reaching for her throat. But Calder was there, stepping between them despite his wounds. Jedrick's momentum carried him forward, and the two men collided, falling into the dust of the square in a tangle of fists and fury. The crowd scattered, giving them room. Clara wanted to intervene, wanted to stop the violence, but Ben's hand on her shoulder held her back. "Let them finish it," he said quietly. "Some debts can only be paid in blood." It wasn't a fair fight. Calder was wounded, exhausted, operating on nothing but will and rage. But Jedrick was desperate, fighting like a cornered animal, and desperation made him dangerous. They rolled through the dirt, trading blows that sounded like meat being tenderized. Jedrick got his hands around Calder's throat and squeezed, his face twisted with murderous intent. But Calder's hand found the charm in his coat pocket. Rowena's charm, the carved bird he'd carried for 7 years. His fingers closed around it, and something in him seemed to settle, to focus. He brought his knee up hard into Jedrick's gut. The grip on his throat loosened. Calder rolled, reversing their positions, and his fist came down like a hammer. Once, twice, 3 times. Each blow punctuated by 7 years of grief and rage and helpless guilt. When he finally stopped, Jedrick Cole lay broken in the dust, conscious but defeated. Blood ran from his nose and mouth, and his scarred cheek was split open, weeping red. Calder stood slowly, swaying on his feet. He pulled Rowena's charm from his pocket and held it up for everyone to see. "This belonged to my sister," he said, his voice carrying across the silent square. Jedrick Cole had it in his possession a week after her death. Harold Wade and Mrs. Chen's daughter saw him drag her to the stables. Clara Wynne witnessed it too. And I'm betting if we search his house, we'll find more evidence he's been hiding. He looked down at Jedrick, and his voice went soft. "You took her from me, took her life, took her future, took every moment she should have had. And I can't bring her back, can't undo what you did. But I can make damn sure you answer for it." Sheriff Garrett finally found his voice. "Jedrick Cole, you're under arrest for the murder of Rowena Boone." His hands shook as he pulled out handcuffs. "You have the right to—" "Save it." Jedrick spat blood into the dirt. "You all think you've won? Think this changes anything? There'll be a trial, and I've got lawyers, I've got money, I'll walk free, and when I do, you won't." The voice came from the back of the crowd. A woman Clara didn't recognize at first. Then she stepped forward and Clara saw it was Margaret Garrett, the sheriff's wife. "I've kept records," Margaret said, her voice steady. "Every bribe my husband took, every time justice was bought and sold in this town. Every deal made to protect men like you." She looked at her husband, and there was steel in her gaze. "I'm done being married to corruption, done raising my children in a town where money buys innocence and women get dragged through streets." She produced a leather journal from her bag and held it up. "This has everything, names, dates, amounts. It goes to the federal marshal, along with testimony about what happened here today. And Jedrick Cole is going to hang for murder, just like he should have 7 years ago." The crowd had gone completely silent. This was history being made, the moment a town decided to be better than its worst impulses. It wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, consequences, pain. But it was a start. Clara felt Calder's hand find hers, his fingers threading through her bandaged ones. He was swaying on his feet, his face gray with pain and exhaustion, but he was smiling. "It's over," he said quietly. "It's really over." Sheriff Garrett led Jedrick away in chains, the man who'd terrorized Red Holler for so long, reduced to just another prisoner. The crowd began to disperse slowly, people talking in hushed voices, processing what they'd witnessed. Some looked ashamed, others looked relieved. All of them looked different than they had an hour before. Dr. Sullivan approached Clara and Calder, his face working with emotion. "I'm so sorry," he said, "both of you, for everything. For my cowardice, for my silence, for—" "Help Calder," Clara interrupted gently. "That's how you make it right. Tend his wounds and make sure he doesn't die after surviving everything else." Sullivan nodded gratefully and immediately began fussing over Calder's blood-soaked bandages. Ben appeared with the horses, ready to get them somewhere safe and quiet. As they prepared to leave the square, Clara took one last look at the place where she'd nearly died. The rope was gone, cut away by Calder's axe. But she could still see the marks in the dirt where she'd been dragged, could still feel the phantom ache of hemp cutting into her wrists. She would carry those scars forever, physical and otherwise. But they were survivor's scars now, not victim's scars. And that made all the difference. 2 days later, after Calder's wounds had been properly tended and Clara had rested in a real bed for the first time in what felt like years, they stood on a ridge overlooking Red Holler. The town looked small from this distance, almost harmless. Smoke rose from chimneys. People went about their business. Life continued, as it always did. "What will you do now?" Calder asked. The bandages were still white around his shoulder, but color had returned to his face. Clara considered the question. A week ago, she would have said she had no idea, that she couldn't imagine a future beyond just surviving the present. But now— "I think I'll stay here for a while," she said slowly. "Help Margaret Garrett organize the women. There are others like me in Red Holler. Women trapped by men like Jedrick, too scared or too beaten down to fight. Maybe together we can change things. Make it so the next woman doesn't have to wait for a mountain man to cut her free. Calder nodded, understanding. And after that? After that? Clara smiled, and it felt strange on her face, a real smile, unforced. After that, I don't know. Maybe I'll travel. See what's beyond these mountains. Find out who Clara Wynne is when she's not defined by fear or pain or someone else's cruelty. Sounds like a good plan. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and amber. Finally, Clara turned to face him fully. What about you? Back to the high country? For a while, yeah. Got some healing to do, and I do that best in the mountains. Calder's eyes met hers. But I won't disappear again. Won't hide from the world like I did after Rowena died, and he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. If you ever want company on those travels, if you ever want someone to watch your back while you figure out who you are, I'd be honored to walk beside you. Clara felt something warm unfurl in her chest. Not love. Not yet. Maybe not ever. They'd both been too broken by their pasts for anything simple or easy, but something like hope, like possibility. Not a proposal, she said, echoing the thoughts she'd had back in the cave. Not a proposal, Calder agreed. Just an offer, a choice. You're free now, Clara. Free to choose your own path, your own future. And whatever you choose, wherever you go, you'll never be dragged by anyone again. Clara thought about that, about freedom, about choice, about the long road ahead of her. She thought about Rowena Boone, who'd never gotten the chance to choose her own path, about all the women in Red Holler and beyond who were still trapped, still hoping for someone to cut their ropes. She thought about Calder, this rough mountain man who'd seen the worst of humanity and somehow held on to enough decency to fight for strangers, who'd given her back her life and was now offering her something even more precious, the freedom to decide what to do with it. Walk with me, she said finally, and held out her hand. Not forever, maybe. Not with any promises or expectations, just walk with me for a while. Help me learn how to stand on my own 2 feet. And when I'm ready, when I'm strong enough, we'll see what comes next. Calder took her hand, his grip warm and steady and sure. I can do that. They turned away from Red Holler together, leaving the past behind them where it belonged. The future stretched out vast and unknown, full of challenges and uncertainties and possibilities they couldn't yet imagine. But they would face it together, not as savior and saved, not as hero and victim, but as 2 people who'd survived hell and chose to keep living anyway. And as they walked into the fading light, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, but something close to it. Something that tasted like hope and felt like freedom and sounded like her own heartbeat, steady and strong, and entirely her own. Behind them, the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. And ahead of them, somewhere beyond the next ridge, the rest of their lives waited to be written.